So I was one of the people that did email Rich about the appropriateness of this talk for this session. And my issue was not about the existence of data in my talk, but rather the fact that I'll actually be focusing a little bit more on some methodological issues. I will justify this by saying that to interpret our data and its relevance for our theories, we need to understand the methods. So that's what I'll talk about today. And specifically, I'll talk about some methods that I think will often be used when we do want to study mixed emotions. And these are intensive repeated measures designs where we sample people repeatedly over time, ask them same types of questions multiple times. And there's various versions of these things, and I think they'll be useful in this context. And I want to give a little bit of context in terms of where I typically do my work, and how it led to kind of some of the issues that I'm going to be talking about today. A lot of what I do is to focus on subjective well-being and the measurement of subjective well-being. And I think that a lot of people have been thinking about the best ways that we can go about measuring subjective well-being. And specifically, people have been investigating techniques like ecological momentary assessment or experience sampling method, where people are given some sort of device that signals them multiple times per day, where they then report what they're doing and how they're feeling when they are signaled. Or less intensive versions of these things, like the more recently developed day reconstruction method, where we ask people to basically reconstruct their day on the next day. So what time did you get up? What did you do at that point? How were you feeling at that time? And then move on to the next episode and repeat that process. So we basically have a map of their entire day and what they were doing and how they were feeling. And now these have been proposed as an alternative to what are more widely used global evaluative measures of subjective well-being, basically standard life satisfaction questions, or people to ask how what sorts of emotions they experience in general. And the advantages that have been suggested for ecological momentary assessment or day reconstruction method are that there might be fewer concerns about memory problems. So for instance, when we try to think back about how often we feel happiness or how often we feel sadness, we might not be able to actually, we might not be able or willing to go back and actually think about all those sorts of things. We also have to aggregate when we are using global measures. So we have to think about all the different domains in our life and aggregate across those to get some overall evaluation, or all the different experiences that we've had to try to come up with some overall evaluation. And actually sampling people over time avoids these problems. In addition, as many of you here will be interested in, if we do study these things over time using these methods, it allows for the study of dynamic processes like those that are going to be involved in the study of mixed methods. So these definitely do have advantages over these sorts of things. And I think that people have pointed those out and advocating for these measures as indicators of subjective well-being. But I think that a lot of times when we think about the validity of these measures and we start to think about the validity of these newer assessment techniques, I think a lot of times people take the criticisms of global measures, the problems with those global measures, and point out that they don't apply to these more intensive designs, but they don't necessarily think whether there are alternative, unique problems that crop up that do challenge the validity of these measures. And these are some of the things we've been thinking about recently. Now, again, to think about context of where these are coming from, I'll actually move even farther away from mixed emotions and trying to make some of the points that I'm talking about here. And I'll talk about 3 relevant studies that I think make some of these points about concerns we might have about these measures when we're using self-report techniques. The first actually comes from an entirely different line of research that I've been doing with a former student on individual differences in within-person variability in personality traits. And one of the things that we've done is we've looked at these studies, we've started to be concerned about how response styles have an effect in these intensive repeated measures designs. Now we know response styles are always going to play a role in self-report measures, but I think that they have some unique effects here when we assess these things repeatedly over time. In addition, this led us to a different question about how asking people things repeatedly affects their responses, and specifically about how asking people about variability actually leads to an increase in the variability that they report. And then finally, I'll take some of the results of that study and start applying them to something that's a little bit more linked to mixed emotions, where we have recently done a study where we compare experience sampling and day reconstruction method techniques for a similar day, or for the same day, where we can basically match the moments that we're reporting on and see how the different responses vary. And this also tells us something about some of the issues that crop up with self-report. Now, again, to go back to those initial studies that we started with looking at intra-individual variability and personality traits and actually looking at these sorts of things, where we started from was this idea that people's personality, or their affect, if we want to talk about that, fluctuates from moment to moment, from day to day and from role to role. We know this, we can show this as we measure these things. But what people were interested in is this idea that people vary in their inter-individual variability. So we know, for instance, in graphs like this, if we study people over the different days of the week, and these are hypothetical data, this is made up as indicated by the humorous font, basically. But basically what we show is that people might be more extroverted on the weekends as opposed to during the weekdays. They might feel more neurotic at the beginning of the week, and perhaps that declines as they move towards their weekend. Whatever the pattern is, we know that there are some general tendencies that people have, but we also know that people might vary in the extent to which they change from this, whether they're reactive to those situational pressures or whether they just change in ways that are more unique to them. So we know that there is variability in this. And a lot of the question that initially got us interested in this is the idea that perhaps individual differences in this variability should be associated with well-being. So some theorists suggested that actually if we look at these sorts of things, the people who are most strongly affected by these situational factors might actually have lower well-being rather than responding to the influence of their true self. They're basically torn by these situational pressures, moved around by these situational things. And there was some initial evidence that suggested that indeed if we calculate variability and compare this to reports of well-being, that people who are highly variable were lower in well-being. So what we wanted to do is to start looking at this, but actually broaden the types of measures that we use. So the initial studies often used questionnaire techniques for getting at this. So they would ask how a person behaved, what their personality was like when they were with their friends. Then they asked those same questions about what they were like with their coworkers, and then they asked them again with what they were like with their family members, and then you would look at variability across these different roles. So we wanted to broaden that and actually do ESM studies, assessing those roles as they happen and people's changes from role to role, and calculating the same types of variable indexes to see whether they cohere, whether we're really measuring something real, and then to see whether those also correlate with well-being. Now, the initial results were pretty promising for us, so the different methods of assessing variability did cohere. So if we had that questionnaire measure and looked at an ESM measure of variability, those cohered. And these different types of variability are even stable over time. So we did a study with ESM measures separated by about 6 months, and the correlations were around 0.7 over time. So we're actually getting at something reliable there. However, we actually also discovered that in the initial attempts, I won't go into the details here, but there were some issues in terms of not adequately accounting for the dependence between the mean and the variability. Once we accounted for that dependence between the mean and the variability and these things and really isolated variability across roles, we found some different results from what had happened in the past. Basically, although the correlations with these traditional ways of calculating variability were moderate to strong, correlations of about 0.4, 0.5, with subjective well-being measures, they dropped basically to 0 consistently across our studies when the appropriate corrections for these mean levels were made. So now what we're finding is that basically we have these measures of variability. We measure them in different ways, questionnaire, ESM, daily diary studies, that are stable over time, so there's some real reliable variance that we're getting there. But they don't correlate with anything else we're measuring. No other personality traits, no well-being measures, none of the types of things that we would typically want to use to explain these sorts of things. So that was kind of puzzling to us. So we started to think about other explanations. What might be picking up when we actually have these variability measures? And one potential was response styles. The first piece of evidence that we had for this was we actually tried to use this type of technique, but vary it in certain ways that should actually lead to something that shouldn't really be that strongly correlated with a person's own cross-role variability. So we basically had them fill out the same type of questionnaire for their friend. What is your friend's personality like as a family member, as a friend, as a worker, as a student, and so forth. And what we found is that when we calculate the variability across the your report of your friend's personality, it correlates an extremely strong 0.64 with your own variability, which seems way too high. This is not that much similarity in how our personalities are like as our friend, which was very concerning to us that we're getting correlations that strong. Now, of course, it may be that we simply have no idea what our friends do as they move from situation to situation, and so we may be more likely to rely on our own behavior. That's one possibility for why we get these strong correlations there. So we then started a series of studies trying to look at other ways of investigating this possibility that we might be getting at response styles when we look at within-person variability in these repeated measures designs. And so what we did is we took two different approaches. First of all, we had people rate their satisfaction with a bunch of relatively neutral objects. This is from the Neutral Objects Questionnaire, I think it's called. People are asked to rate the local speed limits, local public transportation, their satisfaction with 8.5 by 11 paper, all kinds of things that are not only pretty mundane, but also consistent across all the respondents. We then calculate the variability across these ratings of satisfaction, and we'll then correlate this with variability across time in these people or across roles. We also thought that perhaps there's a problem here. Maybe those really variable people really get excited about the moderately good things and less so about the just really, really neutral things. And so maybe there's still an alternative explanation if we found things there. So what we tried to do is to think of something else that they could rate that was similar to what they're doing in the cross-role situations, but also doesn't have these alternative explanations. So we decided that we would have them rate the personalities of multiple people that were constant. So in this case, the Simpsons characters. So we had them go through and rate the personalities of various Simpsons characters and then calculated the variability in their rating across these different characters. Now again, I can't think of any reason why variability across in personality across these characters would correlate with their own variability across time other than with these response style types of issues. So we did this in a couple of different studies. I'm going to show you, and not all of these measures were included in all of them. We had one study with a daily diary study and one study that was just the questionnaire based on with the cross-roll measure. And what we found is that, again, we found pretty strong correlations here. So that measure of your own cross-roll variability correlated between 0.4 and 0.44 and 0.47, pretty strong correlations. With your variability in ratings of neutral objects, 0.45, with variability across the different Simpsons characters, which seems really high to us for things that really should be unrelated. But even with our daily diary study, we started to find that there were correlations there, suggesting that some of that variability there is related to these other response style types of issues. Okay, so that led us to think a little bit more about what happens when we do this. And this is actually a slightly different issue. And actually, a lot of this work was actually inspired by things that happened, research that was done here by Norbert Schwartz when he was here at Michigan, and specifically focusing on how the questions shape the answers that respondents give to us. So we know when we ask people questions, they try to make sense of the question. They don't take that question, they don't just take the literal content of that question and then give us a response. Instead, what they do is participants in our studies make inferences about the questioner's intent. So for instance, in one famous study, two subtly different questions may be interpreted very differently if presented one after another in a questionnaire. So if I ask you first, how happy are you? And then I ask you, how satisfied with your life are you? If those are right after one another, that you actually will give us more different answers to those questions than you would have if you thought they were parts of two different questionnaires or something like that. You assume that if I'm asking this very similar question twice, then I mean something very different by them. And so what we were wondering is whether the exact same question can be interpreted differently depending on the context in which it's presented. And specifically, if we ask you, what's your personality like as a friend? What's your personality like as a worker? What's your personality like as a student? Is that we're communicating to the participant that we want them to emphasize the differences across those roles rather than the consistencies across those roles. So what we had to do is to figure out some way that we could figure out whether by simply asking about these different roles, they actually inflate the variability that they report. And so what we did is we had a design where we asked people first, so we had two groups of people, first in an online component, and they've all answered a global personality questionnaire. And then about a week or two later, they came into the lab, and half of them answered a single role personality questionnaire. What are you like as a student? What's your personality like as a student? Another group instead answered the traditional multiple role personality questionnaire. What are you like as a student? What are you like as a friend? What are you like as a worker? And what we want to know is then what is the discrepancy between the global personality and the role-based questionnaire when they're either given one role or multiple roles. And what we found is that those people in the multiple role condition, these right here are the mean discrepancies between each item in the role and the item in the general condition and the general questionnaire. These discrepancies are bigger when we ask them about multiple roles than they are in the single role condition. Also, here's the correlation between the role-specific personality ratings and their general questions. And again, basically when we ask them multiple roles, those correlations are weaker than if we had asked them about the single role. So they seem to be emphasizing those differences. So simply asking participants the same question multiple times causes increased variability in the responses. This could be due to conversational norms. There are a couple other possibilities we could talk about as well. Now, the question is whether this affects matter. Does this affect any of our substantive conclusions? And so what we did is one final thing that I'll talk about, and actually this is in a different context. What we tried to do is attempt to validate the day reconstruction method by comparing different reports of the same moment using the experience sampling method. So again, as I said before, we asked participants to complete 1 day of ESM with 8 moments of assessment. Next day, participants completed a DRM for the same day. One of the things that's encouraging is that the accuracy was generally pretty high, both for the reports of the activities that they were doing and the emotions that they felt. But what we were interested in is whether when we ask people to do this day reconstruction method, when we say, what were you doing yesterday from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, and how were you feeling? And then we ask them, now what were you doing from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock, and how are you feeling? Then we might be doing something like we did in this multiple role condition, where we say to them, we communicate to the participants that we now want you to emphasize the changes that are going from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock to the next moment, the differences between these situations, and that this effect might actually be exaggerated when we have DRM, where it's very clear we're doing this, as opposed to the ESM. And I'm just going to give you one example here. It's somewhat cherry-picked, but also we did find this pattern across lots of different events that we looked at, is that for comparing the same moments and then looking at the situational factors, these situational factors had a bigger effect in the DRM than the ESM. So for instance, when we look at the ESM, when they were in the positive affect they reported in class versus when they were not in class, the differences are smaller in the ESM study than they are in the DRM study. Basically, when you ask people, oh, how are you feeling when you were in class, they report much less positive, no, it's not a huge effect, but they report less positive affect, and the difference is bigger in the retrospective DRM than in the ESM. So it seems as though that, and this is again, small effects, but consistent across the different types of events that we looked at. So we know intensive repeated measures designs have important advantages over all these alternatives. All the things I said before, they're less reliant on memory, they don't require participants to aggregate, they allow for a study of dynamic processes. But we can't just show that they've eliminated all the problems that we can think of for the global measures. We have to think about whether they have any of their own problems. And even though response styles play a role in all kinds of self-report things, they might play a unique role, a different type of role, a particularly strong role in these types of designs. Simply asking that same question repeatedly may change the meaning of the question, and participants may focus on what is different across situations. Our goal now is to take these types of ideas and put some of these things together to see whether the substantive conclusions would change because of these methodological issues. I'll stop there.